Hello, and welcome to another season of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are doing our Creator Spotlight, or Zero. It's a Creator Spotlight on Kieron Gillen, Stephanie Hans, and Clayton Cowles. And it is also our intro to the series DIE. This will not have any spoilers for the comic. We're just looking at who the creative team is, try to kind of paint the landscape. And it also works as kind of a sales pitch. If you haven't heard of this book before, which I find hard to believe if you hadn't heard of the book, but if you maybe never picked it up, don't know what it's about, we're going to go through that in a non-spoiler, listener-friendly way, and also just let you know who these artists are and why you should read them. If not on DIE, then on something else.
Absolutely.
And I think for the most part, if you read comics, you've probably read one of these three, just incidentally, whether it's big two or indie.
If you read comics, you've read something written by Kieron Gillen. You probably have a comic with a cover painted and illustrated by Stephanie Hans. And you 1000% have a comic that's been lettered by Clayton Cowles.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, that's like on our last one. It's like, is there anyone that doesn't have something from Dave Stewart? They may not know who Dave Stewart is.
Exactly.
Definitely have something from Dave Stewart.
Yeah. So these are people that are around, and for the past, I'd say at least 10-ish years, at least on Kieron Gillen's part, the past 10, 15 years has been kind of a major force in comics. Whether it's, I was going to say whether it's big two stuff, but it's really for Gillen, it's specifically Marvel stuff. Whether it's Marvel superheroes, other Marvel IP stuff, or his creator-owned comics at Image and other places, he's a major force and a major name and a major player.
Let's go right there, because sure. What I wanted to get into is that I don't think I've read really any of the titles he's done at the big two. Mm-hmm. And so I thought of him as a major indie player, and he's definitely a major Image player.
Yeah. Yes.
But I was thinking, well, kind of like kind of dissimilar from a Jason Aaron or someone else who maybe made their name really big first at Marvel. He seemed to kind of do it concurrently.
I think that's a pretty good way to describe it. I mean,
because like Young Avengers was like his big thing, right? Well, early on.
That was one of his bigger. That wasn't his first title, but it was one of the things he was most known for, and that was mainly because he did that with artist Jamie McKelvey, who is someone he's Kieron Gillen's most frequent collaborator. They did a book at Image called Phonogram, which that preceded Young Avengers. So they did that book at Image. Then they go and do Young Avengers, kind of reimagine that team, and then they go from there into Wicked and Divine, which is probably their most well-known and popular series. Is probably the thing that most people know Kieron Gillen from.
Yes, that's definitely where I know the name.
Yeah. So
and I always saw the cover art for DIE and always thought it was cool, but I was like, what does that mean? Just DIE.
Sure. Yeah.
Which we'll get to after we cover the creators.
Yeah. So
it means many things. Is the short answer.
It does. It means a lot of things. Yeah. But yeah, going back to Gillen, as you mentioned, he's been working probably almost 15 years now. We're getting close to it. I want to say started writing with Marvel at about 2009-ish somewhere. That's my notes here. About 2009 is somewhere, and he was writing on some lesser-ish titles, I guess. Foot in the door kind of stuff. He had runs on Iron Man, Uncanny X-Men. Again, this is the era he wrote the X Office in the early 2010s, early mid 2010s. This is before Hickman, the current Krakoa era, which he's come back to now. But his initial foray into the X Office and the X world was in that era, as the X-Men were kind of shunted to the side, backburnered, because Marvel didn't own those. They didn't own those adaptation rights, and so it was a time when the X-Men were not prominent in Marvel publishing. But he was writing then.
Well, it sounds funny to even say like, in 2009 he was on minor titles like Iron Man.
Yeah.
But you think in 2009 the MCU was Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 1.
Yeah.
And that had no impact on comic sales. And I still don't think Iron Man is a big selling comic, even though they get pretty big names on it now.
I think it's consistent. I don't know how. I don't know. It's one of their best selling. It's never really been a best selling.
No, and he's never. Yeah, he's never going to be Batman or Superman.
No.
He's not the flagship character.
No. Gillen also had some runs during then with Thor and Asgardian related books, specifically a title Journey into Mystery. And that's only significant because that's where you met Stephanie Hans. Stephanie Hans.
Okay.
When I get to Hans's work, she has very little interior artwork on her resume in terms of storytelling, interior art, sequential art storytelling. There, DIE is her only, I believe, her first and only ongoing series, and it went 20 issues. She's done shorter runs, she's done individual issues, maybe a small miniseries, a jump in here or there for something. But DIE is her longest work. And one of the things she worked on was Journey into Mystery on these kind of Asgardian titles, Asgardian related titles. So, Marvel Universe, but touch on the side of what we think of fantasy in terms of like in like the swords and sorcerer kind of fantasy, the kind of stuff we see in DIE.
Right.
The aesthetic is most closely related to what we think about when we think of Asgard and Thor and all of them, So her art style really fits there. And again, that's where she first worked with Gillen. So we'll come back to that when we get down to, I guess, to her reviewing her resume there a little bit. After Gillen was at Marvel there for those first couple of years, writing very superhero stuff, he then transitioned away from all that in like 2015. He was still at Marvel, but I don't think he was writing a whole lot of superhero stuff. At that point, he moved into the Star Wars office and spent the next like 4 years writing Star Wars stories. And he was an integral part of the initial wave of Star Wars, So our last book, 8 Billion Genies, we talked about Charles Soule and how Charles Soule came in on the kind of the back end of some of those first wave of Star Wars stuff, and then has been the main architect of this current Star Wars wave. Gillen was kind of the guy in between. The main storyline was started by Jason Aaron, and then eventually Kieron Gillen took over the main storyline. He also wrote the first volume of Darth Vader, the first 25 issues of that, which was happening concurrently with the Star Wars storyline. After that ended, that's when Charles Soule came in and wrote his Darth Vader story. Gillen is probably most notable, at least I think is notable for people who read the comics, as a co-creator of Dr. Aphra, which is one of the new characters, kind of at this point comic only characters. I don't know if she's appeared even in like prose form yet. She's only appeared in comics. She's a fan favorite comic. I should mention credited co-creator for Dr. Aphra with artist Salvador LaRocca and editors Jordan White and Heather Antos. So if you're a part of the Star Wars fandom, kind of the new expanded universe of Star Wars fandom, there's a big following for Dr. Aphra, to the point where after she was introduced in the Darth Vader series, spun off into her own series that Kieron Gillen started. And that spinoff continues now when they ended that first run of Star Wars. Again, that was set between episodes 4 and 5. When they jumped ahead between 5 and 6, Dr. Aphra still has her own series. So a great new character. I have to imagine it's pretty cool to not just create Star Wars canon, but like you're creating characters, and these characters interact with the characters that you knew and grew up with. Like you're
right. I mean, I think I've probably aired my grievances about Star Wars in the past on this podcast, but my complaint is always that the storytelling is too insular. They just keep going back to the same story arcs, the same characters again and again and again. And people keep telling me two things. One, you need to watch Andor. Two, you need to read the Star Wars comics, because the universe is so much bigger and there's so many pocket stories, and you can follow characters that aren't named Skywalker. And, as a cinema goer only with Star Wars, it's been rough. Because the movies have been the worst thing they've done. Because in specific to Star Wars, when you're telling stories that are set within the timeline, it's perfectly fine to have those characters that you already know interact with them. Like the Star Wars comics are about the rebellion. It's just set in between a time period we don't know about. The problem that Star Wars has is when you jump ahead 30 years
and you're still telling those same stories instead of using the new characters. That's where the problem happens. So when you have something like Andor or someone like the comics or things like that, these are interstitial stories that are filling in the gaps, they are expanding the world. And so you are getting what I think are better versions of these characters, because the characters that the way they've been used in other media, like in the characters you saw in the prequels and the characters you saw, some of them you've seen in the sequel trilogy as well. Some of those they've all been brought into specifically the comics and been treated a lot better, because the people that are writing them and people that are creating those stories are way better at storytelling than the people they got to do the movies.
Right.
So yeah, no, they are fantastic. And like I said, Gillen in that part of that first wave of Star Wars stories, he's not in the Star Wars office now. But during that first wave, that first volume, I guess, of Star Wars stories was absolutely excellent. It was critical. He helped author, I think, both the big crossovers. The one between the main Star Wars story and Darth Vader was called Vader Down, and then another one between the main Star Wars line and Dr. Aphra, which is called the Screaming Citadel. So he's really working and bridging across the whole line there. But I said, when in 2020, I guess it was, when they ended that volume and jumped ahead, said he wasn't involved with that, probably with good reason, because what he did do was he jumped back into the X office. And so, as I mentioned, he had written X-Men before Hickman, and now he's back in the office now, and is working on superhero stuff, not just X-Men stuff. Although he had been working on Eternals. He rebooted Eternals and made them not terrible for possibly the first time ever. His version of the Eternals, which relaunched partially in wake of the movie, so it was a title people had in mind, but like they've always been terrible. Like I've only read one non-terrible version. In my mind, that was the Gaiman Johnny Mita Jr. version from like 2008 or something like that, and Gillen's version, which he did with Isad Ribic, who people may know from he did the Thor stuff with Jason Aaron. It's kind of a quasi sequel to that, and it spins him in a way that makes the Eternals not terrible. And by having him do that and bringing him back into the X office, he was one of the people involved with Axe Judgment Day, which was a big crossover that Marvel just did between Avengers, X-Men, and Eternals, which was a very, very good crossover. And he's currently writing the Immortal X-Men book, which is maybe my first or second top X-Men book right now. So it's really, 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 really good. So, I mean, that's what he's doing kind of currently. He also, again, he does have a long history of creator-owned comics. Not going to go through all of them. I already mentioned the two big ones, I think, which are Phonogram and Wicked to Divine. Again, both on Image, both with Jamie McKelvey. I think Phonogram kind of put them on the map. Like I said, they jumped from there to Young Avengers. And then Wicked and Divine, oh golly, people love that book. Like really love that book. And
I think I heard Jason and Rosie give it a big plug on X-Ray Vision.
Yeah.
And I generally trust their I was going to say I completely trust everything they say. That's not true. But Jason, I think, is a great connoisseur. He's a wine taster of comics for me. And he has assured me, I think maybe even during his Harry Potter podcast, the Wicked and Divine thing, or maybe in Marvel Binge Mode or something, he threw it out there as, here's one you might like. And ever since then, it's been on my list, and I think I picked up the whole thing in trade. It's just sitting there waiting to be read.
Yeah.
So
wasn't for me.
But you said you never finished it, right?
I read the first trade,
which is rare for you.
I read the first trade, and I will typically give something the first arc. I want to see the first story. I have so many volume ones of trades. I almost never judge a comic by one issue, because I know people who read a first issue, if it doesn't grab them, they're out. For a superhero story, I will do that because I know I can always come back to it.
Like it'll be there.
If a new creative team takes over Superman or Spider-Man or something like that, I'll read the first one. If I'm not digging it, whatever. I'll check back in periodically to see where we are in the story. If the creative team has changed or a story goes in a way that I like, because I know it's ongoing. With a creator-owned thing, someone like Wick Div, I read the first trade, and it didn't grab me. I wasn't into it, wasn't feeling it. It is finished now. I will probably sit down and read all of it just so I have the knowledge, even if I don't.
Right. So you know what happened.
So I know what it is. Yeah. So I can be conversant with it. Because, it is something that I know. That's one of the books that I know of the people who I know who have read it. The vast majority of them like it. And I'm in the minority of people who did not enjoy it. So most people I know who read it. Well,
and based really on the things that are like, if you like this, you'd like Wicked and Divine.
Yeah.
And vice versa. It seems like it's right in the cross section of stuff that people would tell you. But, every once in a while, there's just a miss like that. And what I didn't hear you say it's bad. You said it's not for me. And I wish people would learn that language.
Absolutely. Well, but I can't say it's bad because I haven't read the whole thing. Like I could read all 4 volumes. Well, that's a
crazy stance. I'm like, I could read the first Twilight and tell you it's the whole series is bad.
Well, yeah, because okay, fine. You can tell bad writing when it's bad writing. Yeah. I don't believe, because I have read enough Kieron Gillen and I've seen Tim McKelvey stuff, that they're not going to make a bad comic. It will be a high quality. It is a good comic. Whether or not the story is good, whether or not the characters are any good, that I can't tell you because I haven't read the whole thing. But when I read that first trade, it didn't grab me. So, it wasn't my thing. And so from a creator-owned standpoint, like I said, I had not, that was my first experience with Kieron Gillen as a creator-owned writer.
Yeah. And that might be a tough, a steep one.
Yeah, it wasn't great, but
it's actually one that I was thinking my wife would love because she loves Greek mythology.
Yeah, and there are elements. Yeah, there. When you talk,
but I would say it's more for like a Percy Jackson reader than a Harry Potter reader.
Yeah, I think I could buy that. We talked about like the matrix of cross section of like if you like A, B, and C and D, you're probably like this thing over here. Like I'm always iffy on things like that because I've heard some of those comps for WickDev, and like it wasn't. I was like, I don't see all those in there. But again, hadn't read the whole thing. So
now out of curiosity, and this is a tangent before I bring it back to focus, but I did pull up on Goodreads Wicked and Divine Volume 1, and it has the readers also enjoyed, which is not saying this is a comp. It's not similar beats or similar characters or anything. It's just saying people who rated this highly also rated these things highly. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, if I had to guess, I would say this is Alex. It's Sex Criminals, Chip Zdarsky, Monstrous, which I know you love.
Yep.
Saga, which we both love. Mm-hmm. Why the Last Man, Paper Girls. So a lot of Brian K. Vaughan fans are into this. Rat Queens and Lock and Key.
Yeah.
And Fables.
Yeah.
Which I know you love Fables. By the way, I saw that.
I read every single one of those books except Rat Queens. Yeah. I read every single one of those books. And
Rat Queens is on my list as well. I bought all of Rat Queens and all of Wicked and Divine at the same time at our Cincinnati Comic Convention last year. I just haven't had the time because we're, in addition to whatever else I'm reading, I'm always reading a book a week for this show. So it slows down my other progress. But the last thing I want to say about Kieron Gillen, when you may even have more things, but the last thing I wanted to point out.
I have one last thing, yeah.
He started out his publishing writing short stories in a Warhammer monthly publication.
I did see that, yeah.
Which is awesome. And it makes so much sense of this book. As soon as I read that, I was like, oh,
where he's coming from.
That's how we got DIE.
Yeah. You understand. You understand what his fandom is. Yeah.
And more than likely, Henry Cavill has heard of him much longer than you and I have.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like
huge
Warhammer junkie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think, Cavill is, obviously when we get to talking about DIE, the obvious comparison is it is a Dungeons and Dragons thing, but it really is any tabletop gaming thing. And amongst the celebrity tabletop gamers, there are those that specifically play D&D, but I do think Cavill, I believe, is specifically Warhammer 40K, right?
Well, he also collects and paints the figurines. I mean, that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
And Warhammer is like a world I don't understand. I know like a friend of mine, their kids in college, and it's like paying their way through college by painting other people's Warhammer stuff. It's like an Etsy shop where you mail him your figurines. He paints and he does beautiful work. I mean, it's beautiful work.
It better be good.
Cool. It's just
not good, right?
I'm just like, man, I thought bags and boards were annoying.
Yeah. Well, so the last thing I want to say on Gillen before we move on is the the other book that I have read from him actually isn't an image book. It's a boom book. It's a book he did with Dan Mora called Once and Future, which is
my gosh, I didn't realize it was him.
Yeah. So Once and Future is a obviously the title alludes to King Arthur, a Legend of King Arthur. It's kind of a twist on that. It is kind of like people in England try to bring back King Arthur for like nefarious purposes, basically is what it is. And what happens is like a bunch of monsters come back with it and all that stuff. And so our main characters are then basically become monster hunters. And it starts off as a very specific King Arthur parallel where various people take on different characters of the story. But as it goes on, I believe it went 30 issues. As it goes on, it draws in all other kind of stories, folklore, tales about England and Britain and things of that nature. So like plays of Shakespeare come in, like Robin Hood and is a character. Beowulf, all these things come in. And it is one of those things of if there's a theme amongst his creator-owned books, there is this sense of, there's always a sense of magic and a kind of other world, whether it's like phonograph, which is kind of, magic through music. Then you have the similar thing with like Wicked and Divine is kind of the magic and godlike abilities through celebrity, through the eyes of a modern day, though. The idea that we live in our world, and then there are these other forces that are kind of put upon it.
Right, which I would say is technically for DIE anyway. I'm gonna say it's technically in the realm of urban fantasy because they live in our world, and when they go, to this fantasy place, we're in the same shoes as they are. They are used to our reality, and they are learning things at the same time. There are different plot mechanics that mix that up a little bit, which we'll get into next episode. But
I think the thing about that though is the main thing, not a spoiler, but about going into DIE specifically, is that when they're in DIE, real time passes.
Yes, real time passes
in both worlds at the same time. So it is they are of our world in a different world. Once and Future is the same way. It is our world, but these legends have are brought back into life. So now you are in your real world. You are in your car driving around places, and like monsters and dragons and stuff are coming out at you. So
my understanding was that Wicked and Divine was the same way. It's our world, but reincarnated Greek gods. Yeah,
exactly. And those gods take the place of celebrities and pop idols and things like that. They're people people that
just listen to yourself.
Receive adoration. Yeah,
like that's a great elevator pitch.
Yeah, it is.
So it's like, that doesn't guarantee the execution, but it's a really clever premise for Wicked and Divine.
Oh, definitely.
Maybe we'll we may just throw down the gauntlet and challenge you to say like, we're going to just commit to this and make Alex read it for the podcast.
Yeah, maybe so. But again, that's a theme of Gillen's, I think very specifically his creator-owned work, that idea of magic, and I want to say I guess it'd just be fantasy, magic and fantasy, and as it blends and works in our world, which I think why maybe some of that earlier stuff he had done with like these Asgardian characters, his tales of mystery and all that, maybe had kind of gotten to start and appealed to him. And it's why, if you know Stephanie Hans's art, why it works so well. I mean, for me on DIE specifically, one of the big selling points was that Stephanie Hans was doing interior artwork, because I didn't know she had done any. She had been one of my favorite covered artists. She remains one of my favorite covered artists. And at the time this book came out, for a few years, I'd been seeing her covers, buying her covers. And so seeing her on the solicitation as the interior, I was like, I'm in regardless, even though, again, this was Kieron Gillen, a guy who's, creator-owned stuff I was a little iffy on because of kind of my personal record with them. So I didn't know where that was going to go, but I was already bought in solely because of the artwork. And if you see it and you look in it and you see how it's painted and the way she uses colors, it really just has that. It has a fantasy vibe to it. There is an otherworldly vibe to the way she draws, quote unquote, real people in the quote unquote real world. The way it's colored, the way it's shaded, everything about it there has this kind of elevated feel. And so I wonder if that's what drew Marvel, or Marvel hire her for these works, for these kind of high Asgardian tales, to work in that quasi fantasy real world realm of swords and sorcery kind of stuff, as much as you get that in the Marvel world. And so seeing her,
that being said, a lot of big two books don't have the publishing time for someone to be doing the art and the colors themselves. That really clogs up the assembly line.
It depends how fast you are. It depends how you work. I don't know exactly how she works. Is it fully digital? Is it, I
guess I'm always amazed what people can do with digital. Her stuff looks analog to me.
It might be. It
looks like paint. But
that's the idea. Is that everything looks painted, whether it is or not. I said I don't know. But again, maybe that is the idea, that maybe part of the reason why she hadn't done a lot of interior work. Again, I have no idea. All I know is she had done some spot things here and there. I'm blanking on it now. Hold on.
How about
Batwoman? Sorry, it was.
It's funny you were going to say that, because I was going to say, based on all the work I've seen of her in 5 different titles, I'm pretty sure her favorite color is red.
Oh yeah, there is
fair guess.
It's very evocative. You can see it there. But I have covers from her, using all different kinds of things, all different kind of publishers, all different kind of characters. But she did one issue of Batwoman during the Rebirth run. It was like a flashback issue for Batwoman. So that's why the style was different and things like that. And it was beautiful. It was so gorgeous. And I wonder if part of the reason, we can give you one issue. And because it's not happening in timeline continuity, maybe the deadline is such where we can slot this in as a flashback here. That's
smart.
What I'm saying? Like there's an allotment there. Maybe she is slower doing interior stuff because her stuff is so intricate. I don't know what the reason is, but or it's also possible she made us really like doing it and made us not be her forte. There are plenty of artists that are just that isn't how they're trained in terms of how to do their art. And so whether or not she wants to, doesn't have the opportunity to, or this one opportunity came and she had to jump at it. It's like she was so in on it and she had to do it. And so she's not looking to do other stuff only if something great comes along. Maybe that's what it is too. But in the meantime, she still pumps out incredible covers. And she is still one of my favorite covered artists. She is someone that if I see coming up that she has a cover for a book, I don't care what the book is, who publishes it. I don't care anything about it. I will always make sure to look for it and look at it and give myself time to decide if I want to order it. Regardless of what the comics.
We both have a growing list of variant artists like that, and it's troubling.
But she's one of my absolute favorites. So.
I'll say the number one distinctive and that I'll say about her art is because I was gonna start talking about realism and semi-realism and all that stuff, and I was like, first of all, I don't know what I'm talking about with that stuff. I learn it as I go. But the stunning thing to me is everything looks like a Renaissance painting in terms of the way it's colored and the smooth lines and everything like that. But the stunning thing on top of that is it looks like beautiful photography. So if you're shooting with a prime lens, if you and your friend take the same picture and you're using, a smartphone and they're using a DSLR with a 35 millimeter lens, the contrast between the foreground and the background on the real camera is just light years of difference between what the phone camera does and her
it's actual focus versus incident focus.
Right. And then there's certain cases of too much. Like last year, the NFL started having these crazy
the 4K
that were really, the background was so blurry. It looked like a green screen when they had it in focus. And I'm like, just because you can get that focus doesn't mean you need to get that focused. And
they only did it for
replays
and touchdown celebrations. So it was pointless. So it was,
right. No, and it was like, yeah, it was just somebody walking on the sideline.
Oh yeah, totally.
But it looked like they were in a Madden game.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just one thing that like popped out at me again and again through volume 1 which is like, sometimes backgrounds are blurry because like Jonathan Hickman talking about Nightly News, it's like, yeah, I put a lot of geometric shapes in there because it was too hard to draw the same room over and over again when I'm trying to do everything on the book. But I also can see when it's distinctly not the case. Mm-hmm. And here things are given scale, they're given proportion, and they're given visual focus by saying, I'm trying to debate what constitutes a spoiler. So I just will leave everything alone. But there's something happening far off, large fiery explosion, and our character's reaction is what we are meant to focus on, and that is what we see in great detail.
I think what you're trying to say is that it's not that there is things in the background are blurry for effect and vibe. Like it's a feel. It's meant to be. It evokes kind of this ethereal nature to the world that you're in, while also again giving you story emphasis of what's in the foreground, what to pay attention to. And as you look, even on some of the big splash pages, what there aren't a lot of. There aren't a lot of big double page splash pages. It's not something to use very often. But even when you have that, the background there is a little blurry. It's a little fuzzy. Like I said, it has this to me this ethereal nature that it feels very otherworldly. As it even in the real world, some of those backgrounds of the rooms or the city, or like when they're out on the street or something like that, and it's kind of rainy. It evokes a very specific sense of feel and place. Which I think is incredibly cool. Because again, I had never seen her interior art. It's one thing when you have a great cover and you've got, and it's a figure and you just do something cool in the background because.
Oh, and whatever, let me say,
you do whatever. So
you probably don't have any memory of this, but coming to comics as an adult, that is sometimes the most confusing thing when you buy something because of the cover art. And then the interior art does not match. And to the point where it's like jarring. Like if Jeff Lemire does a variant cover for somebody and then you go in and it's bright and colorful and you can tell people's faces apart, you're like, what was I sold here on the front cover? Now I'm so immersed in it and I own so many variants that it's just, but there's no analog for it in like I can't think of a way to compare that to any other industry. It's just a comic thing.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I mean,
they're not like, hey, what? Why don't we make like a Bridgerton style movie poster for Guardians of the Galaxy 3?
What I was going to say, the closest thing would be is like those recut movie trailers. Where you cut like a horror movie into using the same footage and all that.
Or Harry Potter 6 into the rom-com.
Yeah, a rom-com into a different genre, that sort of thing. But I mean, what you're buying with that is in my mind, and what I always thought of is I'm buying a piece of art. That's the way I look at it.
That's how I feel, yeah.
Yeah, I'm buying this image, and that's what I'm good with because I love this.
And as a bonus, it comes with a whole book.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And there are plenty of books that I buy because I actually want to read the book. I want to read the story. I want everything on the inside. And there's some things I buy just for the cover. And it's a weird.
Yeah. But if it's wrong, I don't want to be right.
Yeah. So, but yeah.
70 Hans is a great one. So I don't have we use Comic Hub at our comic shop and you can just put search alerts on for, 70 Hans has a cover coming out in 3 months. And I don't have one for it, but now I feel like I need the first right of refusal on all variants. So I'm like, I need to be notified. Let me know, and I'll decide each time.
All I know is I've seen her a couple times at shows. She's a French artist. Kieron Gillen, we should mention Kieron Gillen is a British writer. Stephanie Hans is a French artist, but she has a couple of times been in Chicago for C2E2. I've seen her there a couple times. And the second time I saw her, I may have had 6 or 7 issues, kind of 6 or 7 books for her to sign. And as she was going through them, she complimented these were some of the her favorite ones that she had done, because it was such a wide variety. It was all types of different characters, different publishers. But she said I had a lot of her favorites, and I said, well, that's because these are all of my favorites as well. So it's always great to see when creators, sometimes I've handed books to creators before, and they'd be like, oh, I had no idea this became a cover, because sometimes they don't know. Legitimately, sometimes they don't know when a piece of art is going to be used, when it's going to be used, or anything like that. So, I have surprised people before, but having a book like, oh, wow, was this out already? Or I didn't know they used as a cover, things like that. Maybe they have so many in there, but
I like that she was willing to admit that she liked some of her own stuff.
Oh,
because some of these artists that I've spoken to are kind of a little too much all shucks about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, really? You don't like your own stuff? Why are you charging me $10 a signature?
Yeah.
But
she did not charge too. I don't think she didn't charge at all, which was really awesome.
Yeah, last time you told me about that about someone, they were charging quite a bit of money, which maybe it was like Mike Grell or someone.
Oh well,
like,
yeah.
He didn't charge anything, and it was $20.
Times have changed the past few years now. In terms of when you see them and kind of where they are now. So, but yeah, so that's Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans. The last person credited is Clayton Cowles, who is, or it might be Coles, actually. I'm not quite certain. It's one of those two.
Yeah.
It could be
We'll
Coles.
correct it in
post. Yeah, definitely. But he is one of the most prolific letterers in comics. As I mentioned at the top, if you read comics at all, and I mean literally at all, you have a book that he has worked on, a book that he's lettered. He works for, he is part of the studio called Virtual Calligraphy. So if you have any Marvel book, all their letters are credited as VCs, such and such. So his are VCs, Clayton Cowles. And he works on all of the big Marvel books, like any of the biggest titles, X-Men, I think Avenger. I mean, all the best-selling top titles he is working on. He does a ton of independent stuff as well. A lot of image books, a lot of big-time image books. And he does some DC work. The one thing that stuck out to me is that he seems to letter all of Tom King's stuff, whether Tom King is at DC or like his image book now, Love Everlasting, with Elsa Chartier, is his first creator-owned work. But any work that Tom King's at DC, and maybe a few other things, Clayton Cowles is working on that as well. So he is one of the busiest and one of the best letterers in comics, and you will see that in DIE. He has a lot of work to do in DIE, a lot of different things to show and distinguish and differentiate. So if the lettering were bad in a book like this, I think it would really, really stand out. So the fact that it is so seamless, we do want to mention that he has a lot to do, and he does it very, very well in DIE.
Yes, and I'll say I love a good visual marker, like for instance when caption or someone's speech has a white bubble and an internal thought has a black box.
Yes,
the bubble or the box. I think recently we did The Unwritten, and there were no color distinctions, but there were different shapes around it.
Yes,
and when there's a lot of text on a page, sometimes you have to pause for a second to think like, okay, is someone saying that or someone thinking that, or is that being narrated or whatever? Here it's very clear. If it's an internal thought, it has like red line around the black box, and some characters have a black bubble with white outline on it.
Yeah.
But our main paragons have white caption bubble. So anyway, there are just little visual cues in there that one match the artwork that Stephanie Hans has put on the series.
Yeah, it's yes.
And two, they match the visual style, but they also make it so much easier to read. And it feels like a faster read to me because you subconsciously know who is speaking, what's happening. You don't have to spend any time studying the thing. You can just read the thing.
And I think lettering is one of those things that
you don't notice it till it's bad.
Exactly. Yeah. When it stands out, it typically is because it is bad, and it can, I don't want to say ruin a book, but it makes books harder to read because either A, you can't distinguish, you're spending too much time figuring out who is saying what and thus you're not paying attention to what's being said, or lettering can be bad in that if they use a bad font. If they use a bad font, if it's presented poorly, if it doesn't fit the story they're trying to tell, to fit the artwork, then you're laboring trying to figure out what the damn words are. So again, you're doing
there's
everything
nothing worse.
You're doing everything but just read the story and absorb it. So
yeah. When they make the story opaque and it's harder to access it ironically through the words. It's like you've really failed your job as a letterer. Even though I can imagine, and I'm thinking of like when things get somewhat cursive-y or slanty, or even like the Wilson Taylor letters in the OGN.
The cursive, the handwritten stuff. Sure,
I found that very cumbersome to read, and love the series, love the book, love all the creative team, but for that one thing, it was like, man, those pages felt like a slog because I only sort of read cursive anymore.
And that's a valid criticism, although you can understand what they're trying to do there. Again, that's
right. I can imagine
instant
how
visual
you pitched
signifier.
It, and how you showed, you showed the rest of the 100%. Team, like you put it like, here's the font I created. Look at it; it's beautiful. It looks like
handwriting.
It looks like a handwriting.
And everyone's a go.
Right. And then you see it in execution. You're like, it's actually kind of small, and they squished in, and it still has to fit on this page, no matter how how crazy it looks.
Not just fit in this. It's got to fit in this panel in this box. That sort of thing. There are a lot of constraints to it. So that's a absolutely valid observation. It's one of those things where, again, that's an example of, maybe we call it bad lettering, but it's something that on paper seemed like a great idea, because the Unwritten did so many things with fonts to give you that instant visual signifier that you knew, oh, this is a font for our world. Now we're in the story world. This is when someone is talking, there were so many levels to it. And when Wilson was doing the lettering of the journals, that was another way to signify this is another way we're getting the story being told to us. And it just so happens that it was harder to read because, a lot of people maybe can't read cursive, and you can't get through it as quickly as, something that's just written in all caps, which is the whole point of that, is to be super obvious and super easy to read.
Right.
When you make that kind of font choice there, but when lettering is bad, it can. I think you called it a struggle. It feels like a slog to get through, and that's unfortunate. So I think what DIE does, because of the various ways they use lettering in the book, I think it does a really, really, really great job. So that's our creative team. Do we want to? I guess we'll go into the book a little bit. Try to do a little synopses here. Try to
as much as we can without spoiling it. And the funny thing is, I was thinking to myself, how much can I say without a spoiler? And so, how about this as a teaser? This is the second book we've covered this year with Tolkien in it, and the Bronte sisters.
This is true.
We're recording this in May 2023, and I'm like, oh, I see how what we do could be perceived as like snobby comics.
A little bit,
because
it's
like you could miss those references and it wouldn't hurt your story experience at all.
Oh no, and I think this is an interesting book on many levels in that way, because of there's a specificity to it that is, I don't think, necessary, and I think we'll go into that a little next week. But I think we can, real quick, we'll go through. DIE is 20 issues long. It's collected in 4 trades. 5 issues per trade, 20 issues, 20-sided die. If you are familiar with tabletop role-playing games, that'll make sense. There is one big hardcover edition too, a really nice, big, beautiful hardcover that's got everything in it. So one of those ways to get the book that's out there. It's the thing that always jumps out to me, and I think this came from something that Kieron Gillen said when he was asked about it. He called it goth Jumanji. And I think he threw that out. He threw that out there a little bit glib, and then people latched onto it. And then I think he regretted it a little bit because it was a little too glib, But it's not inaccurate. It's not inaccurate at all. So I think we can give away a little bit of the idea is that, and I don't think this is a giveaway because it was in the official synopsis of the solicitation. Do we want to go into that? Do you have that there, or?
I don't have the solicitation up, but with the miraculous technology known as the internet.
Here we go. I got it here. I got it.
Because I'm reading digital right now.
Well, there are actually, I think there were two synopses for it, different ones, but this is what I think was on the
I got the back cover up now.
One. Yeah. In 1991, 6 teenagers disappeared into a fantasy role-playing game. 2 years later, they reappeared over 50 miles away from where they vanished. And there were only 5 of them. 25 years later, they are drawn back into the game to discover that nothing ends until they finish the game.
Wow. Okay, that's actually...
It basically gives you the synopsis is basically what happens in the first 15, 20 pages of the comic. Like they recount some of this history.
Sure.
There,
Yeah, no, but that's more than it says on the back cover of Trade 1.
Okay, read that one there.
So back cover Trade 1, in the 90s, not even specifying the year, just in the 90s, 6 teenagers disappeared into a fantasy role-playing game. Only 5 returned. Nearly 30 years later, these broken adults are dragged back to discover the game isn't finished with them yet, with an ellipsis.
Okay. All right.
That was enough for me to buy it. I mean, that's I did buy it based on that.
Sure. I guess that synopsis in the must have been from the original solicitation is a little more specific, I guess, because the years actually are important, and they're only important because, as we mentioned, when it said they disappeared from 1991, 1993, they were gone for 2 years, meaning they spent 2 years in the game. So that's important to know that it wasn't like they spent an inordinate amount of time and they came back and found out it was 2 years later. They knew how much time they spent to come back and realize, oh, that time passed in our world as well. So the years are a little specific. And it does coincide with the time the book was published. So they go back in as adults in the year 2018, because that's when the book first came out. It was in December 2018, and it ran through September 2021 to get to the 20 issues there. So it is happening in quote unquote real time. And that's something to keep in mind in terms of how the mechanics of the fantasy world work, which we'll get into a little more next weekend as we go on. Because it's
quite different from Narnia.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a comparable pool.
And a lot of other fantasy worlds as well. The idea of being transported into a world like that.
Yeah, the magicians.
It doesn't always work like that. So the other thing I think we'll mention going into it is because I think this is a barrier for some people, because I've heard from people like that who say it's a barrier, is that, I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons. And they say that as an excuse to, I'm not going to like this book. And now I think both you and I have not played D&D, correct?
No, I'm open to it, but no, I've never done it.
What is your level of familiarity with with how D&D works? Like, how much do you understand?
So almost everything I know I learned from Dan Harmon. So the 2 D&D episodes of Community.
Okay.
And then he did a web series called, Harmon Quest, where he would sit down with other celebrities and he would play D&D with them. And then someone came in afterwards and would, like, when they're doing momentous scenes in their D&D, someone would come animate it and put like a cartoon animation.
Sure.
It's it was a very cool show. And they were being kind of fun and lighthearted about it. But I am also only like 1 degree separated in like 7 or 8 different instances. I know a lot of people who do campaigns monthly, and it's just one Saturday a month. That's what they do.
But you understand the mechanics of the game in terms of creating a character.
Yes.
Yeah.
But like you build your attributes, you build them over campaigns and years. You can take them. If you move to another city, you can bring your character with you.
You also understand the role of the dungeon master, the person who is creating the story. Okay. So those are the basic facts. And I think what you need for understanding, getting into DIE is just that base level. I think you have to understand that it's a role-playing game, that each person takes on a character and a persona, which I think a lot of people know that based on some of the pop culture moment per se that D&D has had. You mentioned Community and Dan Harmon. That's obviously a big thing. It's been on Stranger Things. It was on Freaks and Geeks. The Dungeons and Dragons movie was recently out. That was a lot of fun. Although, things like that I guess there's a disconnect. Oh, sorry, there's not a disconnect. There's two ways to approach D&D. There's what you can do like what you were talking about with Dan Harmon there and what they did in like Stranger Things and all that, where you're filming them playing the game. And then there's what like the D&D movie did. And we talked about with the animation of the Harmon Quest. And I think it's what Critical Role does, which is them showing you the actual results of the campaign as if you're watching that story. So are you watching people play the game, or are you watching what happens in the game, the results of that? So there's two ways to look at it, I think. And I think if you just go into it of knowing that each character takes on a persona in a fantasy setting and world, and there are a bunch of different shaped dice. Like, I think legitimately that's all if you understand that.
And that the dungeon master can build out the world. Typically all in advance.
That helps. That helps.
But
yes. Yeah.
But I think with this one in particular,
there is
the dungeon master's control of the world.
But I think they explain that though. But I think most people, if you ask them about Dungeons and Dragons now, if you ask them about D&D, that's probably what they can tell you about it. And I think that's all you really need to know, because I think they explain, because they're not actually playing D&D. And of course, the story is they go back into the game. So once they're in the game, they're not actually playing it in the conventional way we think of playing D&D. Like they go through quests and things like that, but they're not actually like rolling the damn dice and things like that. You know what I'm saying? So you don't have to know those mechanics. You just have to be familiar with the setup. So I know a lot of people that said that's a barrier to them. Like, well, I don't like D&D. I've never played it. I'm not going to. No, you don't have to know that. This is a fantasy world. And really it's another, in a lot of ways, it's another story about stories. It's about stories and storytelling. It's about world building and things of that nature. This just happens to be telling stories and building worlds specific to games.
Right. To me, that would be like saying, I can't go see a Marvel movie with you. I don't read comics. It's like all you need to know is like that comics exist and You're good. And no one, for the record, has ever said that. But D&D is this weird thing. Because a friend of mine suggested going to she was on a date last week and suggested going to see D&D, and the guy she just recently started dating was like, I don't know, I don't really play D&D anymore. And she was like, how is that relevant to seeing the movie? Like, it's just like, just say you don't want to go.
D&D holds a very specific place in nerd culture as maybe the epitome of nerd culture, that of all the nerdy things that people do and that have become mainstream and have and that have just become popular culture and become culture, D&D, tabletop gaming in this way, role-playing games in this way, dice-based role-playing games in this way are seen as like, that's still like a bridge too far. And so the shorthand for that is D&D. And so even though there are plenty of people out there. I think we mentioned Henry Cavill is a humongous nerd playing Warhammer 40K. Joe Manganiello, who people might know from Magic Mike, is maybe like I actually think he has worked for D&D, like as like a creative consultant. Like he loves this, and he runs a game in Hollywood with some of the biggest names and people. This is a huge part of his life. And yeah, he's one of the dudes taking the clothes off in Magic Mike, so like he was the original Flash Thompson, Flash Thompson in the original iteration was the ultimate jock, like this is who he looks like, and yet he plays D&D, and it's like, well, it's okay. He's cool because he's ripped and handsome and an actor and things like that. But the stereotypical person playing D&D is still, the kids on Freaks and Geeks. It's still the weirdos on Stranger Things and things like that. So that perception still exists, I think. But I do think it is changing, because there are those kids are growing up, and there are the people that are like Dan Harmon who are making television now. The guys who made the D&D movie were the guys who grew up playing this stuff and have done other things in Hollywood. So the perception is changing there, but it does still carry that stigma. So if that is something that potentially worries you as a reader, I would say get over it. It is a fantasy story. So you mentioned a Narnia comp. It's absolutely a Narnia comp.
Narnia, the magician, probably closer to the magicians.
It's closer. It's closer in tone. Yes, because it is far more adult. It's closer. Yeah, it's closer to Fillory and the magicians.
That being said, we
Jumanji.
Can't.
Yeah.
Right. Oh yeah, goth Jumanji.
Yeah.
And Jumanji is what I was saying when I was reading this book. My wife asked me what it's about.
Yeah.
That being said, you can't shy away from the Narnia comparison because he does. On one of the introductory pages to, I think issue 5 is a quote from Narnia. So it's like, he's not being shy about his influences. And there's a quote from the Bronte sisters. We'll get into all of that next week in volume 1.
Absolutely. And what I'll close by saying is that this is a book that is aware of all those things. It is a book. It is our world. So it is our world where Tolkien exists, the Brontes exists, C.S. Lewis exists. All these fantasy stories, all these worlds, all these fictions, everything that we know, everything that you know, I guess they know. And the only difference is
firmly
into
urban fantasy.
Yes. The only difference is the Chuck character who writes his own novels and has his own film, but that doesn't exist in our world. But anything that we know, any story that we know, any fiction that we know, any fantasy that we know, they know. And I agree. This would then fall into that urban fantasy world, even though the majority of the action does not take place in our world.
No, but it doesn't matter.
Our characters are rooted in the
truth
world,
is,
right?
we do not have to forget all of the knowledge of our world.
Yes.
In order to learn all of the knowledge of their world.
In fact, that knowledge is not a prerequisite, but as you mentioned, it helps. If you know those references, if you know those stories, it helps feed, and you can see what they're trying to reference, what the game is trying to reference. The world they're in is very specific into why it's referencing certain things. So it isn't just Gillen and Hans and them like, hey, what if we did this? It'd be kind of cool here. No. The game itself, the world that they go into when they're playing the game is referencing these things for a very specific reason. So it does help to know if you have that literary background. So, but you're right. There is this, we are building this portfolio of like really highbrow elitist storytellers. Yeah. Which isn't maybe too far off the actual truth, but we probably shouldn't portray that too
no,
openly.
I'm into it. Look, as long as there's if we like start reading only comics that are riffing on Proust or something, then I think we have to take a hard look in the mirror. But it's like the Bronte sisters, and that's all like public domain. And a lot of people there's no way you went and read The Unwritten with us and missed every single literary reference. Like if you graduated from public high school, as I did,
some of the stuff you had to read in school,
right. And I think, there's probably some wisdom to that. And I'm kind of wondering, since both of those guys we're referencing this year are British authors, perhaps a lot of this stuff is baked into British school curriculums.
Could be too. Yeah.
Where they're just like, I'm going to tell stories with common knowledge stuff.
Maybe we should mention that too, that we talked about these teenagers, they do disappear from England. They are British. So,
right. Totally, I will confess, I do not read with a British accent in my head.
It's tough. I do not either.
I did actually for The Unwritten. Like,
really?
I knew that was a British thing. And I just, as I was reading dialogue, I just kind of, and especially, when, I don't know, 7 and 8, when they go to Australia and the Australian character, I just kind of hear the voice with an Australian accent.
That's true. I don't know if I read in. I actually don't know. I know this book I definitely didn't, but then you bump on something because it is lettered, obviously. So I mentioned Kieron Gillen, British, Stephanie Hans, French, Clayton Cowles, American. But if you notice some of the spelling, it is British spelling. So if you things like favorite, flavor, things like that, there are a lot of extra U's in there as they, for American audiences.
You can tell which side you're on by calling them extra or not.
That is true. That is true. But we're Americans, so yes, there are extra letters there, but you notice that it is lettered in that way. So yeah, maybe you're right. Again, this I think goes back to the idea of pulling from some of the sources there that he's familiar with, and that maybe these are maybe a little more familiar. That that maybe more people that just know Tolkien, know the Brontes, things like that. He's not stopping to explain them to you. He's presenting them and referencing them and using them for his purposes. But yeah, they're not stopping to give you a full rundown up until only for when it suits their story.
Right.
They're holding your hand through it, and they're leading you through the story. So they're not letting you grope around blindly, but they're not like force feeding it to you. And I think there's a lot of skill and tact in that. So yeah, no, I'm excited to get started and talk about it next week.
Yes. We will see you next week for Volume 1 Fantasy Heartbreaker. Go to your local comic shop, pick up a copy, $10 for the first one.
I think so, maybe. Public library as well. Yeah.
Public library, Hoopla, Comixology, wherever you got to get it, just get your hands on it and, try to do it in the way that pays the creator somehow. But issues 1 through 5, if you're going a single issue, and get those in your hand, tear through them. I think it's a pretty quick read. Kind of a thick trade, but a quick read.
It is.
And we will see you next Thursday for Volume 1.